All right, hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Lucy and I'm going to be chairing this session. I am a PhD student at the moment working in UCL in London on chemical engineering, or attempting, I should say, PhD at the moment. See if we get through. But it is my honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nathan Bossoh. And I think I'm especially grateful that I get to introduce him because I did a little bit of research and you got your PhD from UCL. So there is hope at the end of the tunnel. I can see this. I'm like, oh, there's a possibility here. And so, yeah, it's an honor to be able to have you here today, Nathan. And just looking at what you've done and a bit of you online, I mean, very multi-talented. Oh my word. So PhD from UCL. And at the moment, I know you're a research curator of African collections at the Science Museum. I think you're working to deliver a report appraising over 5,000 historical African materials, among other things, a bass player as well, and all sorts, and published on multiple topics. So thank you very much for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak with everybody here. And it's a really nice one because I've attended many. Hopefully, you can hear me and all is good. Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I've attended many CiS talks and I've been a member for quite a while, and I've seen numerous people present over the years, and so. Yeah, it's very much a pleasure to be able to be at the stage where I'm able to kind of share my own kind of knowledge and input something into the organization. So very much appreciated. I will try and share my screen. And so yes, my talk is called Science, Christianity and Representation, Ethnic Dimensions past and present. And I should say that I similar to Cara before me, I think I've also somewhat struggled with a talk of this nature because it does touch on topics that are uncomfortable and I would say not often spoken about in these kind of science and Christian contexts. And so I'm bringing something to light that's personal to me from an academic perspective, of course, but quite personal to me. And so it's been an interesting one, quite a bit of a journey. And also, it's still a developing thing for me as well in terms of my research and my personal journey as a Christian navigating this space. Let me just hold on. So in the New Testament book of Galatians, which was written by the missionary and apostle Paul, we read about an interesting account of a severe disagreement between Paul and Peter surrounding the question of what culture followers of Christ should adopt to be considered proper followers of Christ. In this occurrence found in chapter 2 of Galatians, we see that Peter, who is a Jew and follower of Christ, is eating and fellowshipping with the Gentiles. Eating and fellowshipping with the Gentiles who are non-Jewish followers of Christ. Jesus himself, of course, was of a Jewish background, and so Jews did indeed have a unique connection to Jesus by heritage. When at some point more Jews came to where Peter had been freely eating and fellowshipping with the Gentiles in Antioch, Peter slowly separated himself from those Gentiles. Increasingly, Peter then urged those Gentiles to begin acting more like Jews so that they could be more accepted within the Jewish Christian circle. This activity is somewhat strange coming from Peter, because Peter was well aware that cultural practices did not make one more or less of a believer in Christ. Yet because of cultural differences, Peter did not want to be publicly associated with the Gentiles, despite their agreed belief in Christ. When Paul, also a Jew, found out about what Peter had done, Paul criticized Peter, saying, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" In this statement, Paul essentially called out Peter's inconsistency. Peter was very aware that as Christ followers, the Jewish way of living was in no way the universal way to act as a Christ follower. Yet when fellow Jews were present, Peter disassociated himself from the Gentiles and then urged those Gentiles to suppress their own cultural customs in order to fit in with the Jewish cultural customs. This event in chapter 2 of Galatians has significant relevance surrounding current issues in the cultural ethnic disparities which are evident in the UK science sector. What role has Christianity historically played in relation to these modern day disparities within the sciences, if any at all? And why is it important to understand the connections between science, Christianity, ethnicity, ethics, and culture? I hope to tease out some of these connections in this talk. So we'll shift from a biblical quote to a modern day quote. And the quote reads, in 2018, Robert McCoy, who you can see on the screen, discovered that he was the only Black chemistry professor in the United Kingdom. For a decade, he'd assumed there were others who he just hadn't met, until investigations by the UK Royal Society of Chemistry revealed his lonely status, unquote. This statement is from the opening paragraph of an article published on the 14th of December 2022 in the journal Nature. The Nature article, which is entitled "How UK Science is Failing Black Researchers in 9 Stark Charts," documents the latest and quite startling statistics about the lack of Black potential being realised in the UK science sector. It investigates issues such as ethnic minority undergraduate and postgraduate enrolment, UKRI funding opportunities, and diversity in junior level up to professor level academic jobs. Overall, the investigation found that between 2020 and 2021, only 8% of students in the sciences were Black, and that subjects such as engineering and medicine were more likely to attract Black students as opposed to subjects like physics or biology. It's well known within Christian scientific circles that for young British Christians potentially interested in a scientific career, the popular notion of conflict between science and religion can serve as a compelling hindrance against further engagement. Less spoken about, however, is the fact that for young Black British Christians, cultural factors based on ethnicity can also serve as a secondary layer on top of the notion of conflict, contributing to their non-engagement with the sciences. In other words, even if young Black Christians engage in a career, they are still likely to develop a sense that while science is certainly something that white Christians do, it's not necessarily something that Black Christians do. For those few Black Christian students who do push past these barriers, they will almost certainly struggle to find a representative number of students and teachers that they can identify with. And not too long ago, there's a student, well, she's just completed her degree in biology, someone I knew from my church, and she's a Black female student in biology, studied at Essex, and I asked her to fill out a couple of questions in relation to her experiences as a student with that identity on her course. One of the questions I asked her was, and I won't say her name for confidentiality purposes, but one of the questions I asked her was, I said, would you say that you found a good representation of Christian students and teachers on your course? To which she said, there were a few Christians on my course, but we were definitely the minority. There might have been more, but when it came to religion, people tended to keep their views to themselves to avoid ridicule. as far as I know, we had no Christian lecturers. In fact, most of our lecturers would openly mock/dispute creationism, as they would call it. Then I asked her a second question about her Black identity in this space. So I said, in terms of undertaking your degree in biology, would you say that there was a good representation of Black students and teachers? Her response was, in my first year, when our course was more broad, there was a good representation of Black students. But I noticed that once I started doing more environmental modules later in my degree, that it started getting less diverse. There were 5 Black students, myself included, in a class of 50. In terms of teachers, I had no Black teachers throughout my undergraduate degree. As a Black British Christian myself, interested in the sciences to some degree, I'm not a scientist myself, over the last few years, these issues of disparity have become of considerable concern to me. And so as an academic historian, I've been increasingly trying to better understand its emergence from a historical perspective. So the bulk of the rest of my talk will be a historical exploration of this modern phenomena. This will be done by exploring 3 specific developments in medicine, cranial anatomy, and anthropology during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to better understand some of the ways in which the history of science, medicine, and Christianity have been interconnected with race and ethnicity. As a warning, we will venture across uncomfortable themes in the history of science, ranging from slavery to racism and imperialism. But this is essential if we want to better understand and address modern ethnic disparities, particularly as Christians in science. So we begin our exploration in the 17th century with one of the oldest and most reputable Western scientific societies in the world today, the Royal Society of London. When the Royal Society of London opened in 1660, it marked a new era in the history of modern scientific development. Members of the Royal Society pioneered the new observational experimental mode of science, which remains at the heart of much scientific practice today. Contemporary historians such as Professor Peter Harrison have documented in detail how the Genesis account of the fall of Adam and Eve and the reclaiming of that lost Adamic knowledge provided strong theological justification for the rise of the experimental scientific method, which was assiduously carried out by members of the Royal Society. Whilst most of us probably know something or perhaps a lot about the Christian underpinnings of modern science, less of us are aware of the ways in which science in this same period was equally intertwined with other political and institutional endeavors, such as the transatlantic slave trade. Alongside the Royal Society, the Company of Royal Adventures trading to Africa was established in 1660 in England as a West African trading company. The company's initiative was to trade goods with West Africans, which might bring about economic benefit for England. But in 1663, the King of England, Charles II, granted a royal charter to the company, in which the charter explicitly sanctioned, quote, the buying and selling, bartering and exchange of for and with any Negro slaves, unquote. In 1697, James Petiver, who was a natural historian, apothecary, and member of the Royal Society, wrote an article for the Royal Society's scientific journal, Philosophical Transactions. The article was entitled A Catalogue of Some Guinea Plants. In this period, Guinea meaning West Africa. Within this article contained information about West African medical knowledge unknown to England at this time. It documented the ways in which West Africans had been utilizing medicinal plants in order to heal a plethora of bodily discomforts and issues. The article contains 10 full pages, complete with African plant techniques such as grounding, crushing, rubbing, boiling, mixing, and drinking in order to heal a range of mild to serious conditions such as itching, bleeding, buboes, scurvy, toothaches, belly aches, worms, and so on. Perhaps most interesting is the fact that the information in this Royal Society article was not gathered by James Petiver, but rather by John Smith, who was also a member of the Royal Society. John Smith had been stationed on the West African coast as a minister in the Cape Coast Castle. The Cape Coast Castle had become the main British holding ground or fort since 1665 for enslaved Africans who were to be shipped off to the Americas to participate in forced labor. It was John Smith's endeavors functioning to help run the British slave trade, alongside gathering new medical knowledge, that led to James Petiver's publication in the Philosophical Transactions in 1697. Noticeably absent from the publication are the names of any African individuals who had clearly taught John Smith the numerous plant healing techniques that he then communicated to Petiver. This is despite the fact that James Petiver wrote in the publication itself that, quote, many advantages would accrue to the art or mystery of physique, i.e. general medicine, if the virtues of all simples, i.e. plant medicines, were more nicely inquired into. I shall therefore waive it here and only present you with an African materia medica, i.e. an African pharmacology, unquote. And so in this first brief case, we can see an early and obvious, yet little known historical episode of what we might call African knowledge marginalization. Through the cultural activities of the Royal Society members and how these activities were connected to both Christianity as well as the British slave trade. Although medical knowledge was gained, the African providers of this medical knowledge went unrecognized within the wider context of slavery. We travel now to 18th century Europe, which is commonly referred to as the Enlightenment period, usually understood as a time of reason and scientific progress. This is the century in which Newtonian mechanics, for example, was established as a core scientific principle. However, this is also the same century in which we see the emergence of what historians call race science, or simply science that justified a racist outlook. The emergence of race science in the 18th century can be marked by different European works, but one of the most foundational works was written by Johann Blumenbach, who lived between 1752 and 1840, publishing his On the Natural Varieties of Mankind, as you can see on the screen, in updated editions beginning in 1775. Blumenbach was one of the leading German anatomical researchers and lecturers in his time, and in his Natural Varieties of Mankind, Blumenbach became the first person in Europe to divide humans into 5 different races, as you can see on the screen. He placed the white race, i.e. Europeans, at the top of the hierarchy, whilst placing the black race, i.e. Africans, at the bottom, based on skin color variation and his measurements of collected African and European skulls. Blumenbach's work is often credited as popularizing European race science from a scientific perspective. However, there's a lesser known yet significant theological orient to his racial thinking. Blumenbach actually established his racial hierarchy fundamentally as a critique against the practice of slavery, which was in full swing by 18th century Europe and America. His position at its core was that even though humans came in many varieties or races, they originated from one stock, just as the Bible had declared. Therefore, the practice of slavery essentially constituted enslaving one's own brother or sister, and this simply could not stand. Yet, even if all humans were of the same original stock, Enlightenment figures like Blumenbach were still puzzled by how human skin color around the world differed so much. Just why was it that Europeans were so white, whereas Africans were so dark? Thus, in order to combat slavery, whilst also answering the puzzling question of human skin color variation, Blumenbach turned to climate as his principal answer. In sum, Blumenbach argued that at the time of biblical creation, all humans were of one original white color, but over time, as humans spread to different regions of the world, the humans that went into hotter regions turned darker, whilst the humans that stayed in cooler regions remained white. Blumenbach summarized his argument in the following, quote, "For in the first place, that stock, i.e. the white stock, displays the most beautiful form of the skull. Therefore, it is white in color, which we may fairly assume to have been the primeval, i.e. original, color of mankind, since, as we have shown above, it is very easy for that to degenerate into brown, but very much more difficult for dark to become white," unquote. For Blumenbach then, Black people were certainly human and created by God. However, they were also a sort of degraded offshoot of the original white stock, which was more beautiful. In a sense, the Black skin color was an accident of nature and time. This racialized hierarchy held strong well into 19th century Britain, i.e. Victorian Britain, and wider Europe, particularly during the emergence of the supposed conflict between science and religion, which developed in the second half of the 19th century. And so it's to this period and to this conflict that we now turn to as our last case. When we speak about the conflict thesis between science and religion in history, the average person may immediately think about the impact of Charles Darwin on Christian theology. If you've delved into the subject matter in some more detail, then you may know names such as Thomas Henry Huxley, the British biologist, John Tyndall, the British physicist, or even Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper, the American literature scholar and chemist, respectively. Other influential yet lesser known names might include John Lubbock or Edward Burnett Tylor, both British anthropologists and major players in the development of the conflict myth between science and religion. For time consideration, we'll take Tylor as our point of focus. Edward Burnett Tylor was by far one of the most influential British anthropologists of his day, and his 1871 publication, as you can see on screen, Primitive Culture, is often regarded as establishing a new branch of anthropology called cultural anthropology. Unlike Blumenbach's work, which focused on human physical differences, Tylor's anthropology dealt primarily with human cultural differences, such as religion, language, technology, scientific knowledge, music, law, and so on. Born in 1832 in London, Tylor was well known in the British scientific circuit and eventually became the first professor of anthropology at Oxford University in 1896. Although he had grown up in a Quaker family, he, like many Victorians of his time, slowly began to doubt Christianity, and by the 1860s, it seems he had turned towards a position of religious disbelief. Unlike many of his contemporaries, however, Tylor did not simply think that religion was something that society needed to be rid of. Rather, he felt that religion should be scientifically investigated, even if it was ultimately false. In his major work, Primitive Culture, Tyler's conclusion about religion was that higher religions such as Christianity and Islam were birthed from lower religious beliefs such as animism, which were practiced by our human ancestors. Tyler's position was that religion, broadly understood, was ultimately false, and that science and technology would eventually outgrow religious belief. So here we see Tyler's version of the conflict thesis clearly in motion in his contrast between science, technology, and religion. However, Tyler's 1871 book was fundamentally about cultural development over time. And it's here where we see how his racial, ethnic assumptions integrated with his arguments about the progression of science and regression of religion. Taking from European positivism, Tyler arranged the history of humanity into 3 stages: the original savage or primitive stage, next the mid stage, which was still somewhat barbaric, and finally the modern civilized stage. Tyler went on to suggest that the best way to learn about our primitive ancestors was simply to observe and study the primitive cultures still in existence today. In effect, contemporary primitive cultures were living vestiges of past primitive cultures. In the introduction to his 1871 book, he stated that, quote, the modern savage state in some measure represents an early condition of mankind, out of which the higher culture has gradually been developed or evolved, unquote. So who were the modern savages around the world still in existence that Tyler spoke of? When given examples of primitive or savage cultures, Tyler routinely referenced Africans, South Americans, or Aboriginal Australians. In contrast then, who were the higher cultures that Tyler spoke of? In the introduction of his book, Tyler explained that, quote, the educated world of Europe and America practically settles a standard by simply placing its own nations at one end of the social series and savage tribes at the other, arranging the rest of mankind between these limits, according as they correspond more closely to savage or cultured life, unquote. How then was this all tied together? Tyler positioned his science and religion conflict argument within this cultural hierarchical framework. He suggested that the civilized European and American cultures had developed scientific knowledge and specialized technology, whilst the savage non-Western cultures around the world still held onto false primitive ideas such as animism and mythology, and lacked advanced technology. When it came to the prevalence of Christianity within the Western world, Tyler simply argued that Christianity was an advanced version of animism. Yet, since it came from the savagery of animism, Christianity was ultimately false. So in bringing out these 3 distinct historical cases, one of my goals is to show why Christians must become better at facing the uncomfortable side of what has often been called progress in the history of science. By primarily focusing on the positive and avoiding the more ambiguous or negative, we fail to understand that for many peoples and cultures around the world, and indeed within Britain, science is not so naturally appealing precisely because of its historical association with slavery, racism, westernization, and empire, to which Christian considerations were not absent, but often a part of the mix. In coming to my final 2 points, I'd like to finish by returning to the account of disagreement I opened with in the book of Galatians. Circling back to Paul's dispute with Peter, I think that a key connecting factor underpinning the historical cases I've brought out over the last half an hour, beyond the more obvious matter of human sin, is human culture. Science is an intellectual activity, but science is also a cultural activity exactly in the same way that music, art, technology, and so on are. Science, therefore, is always shaped by cultural norms. Thus, it's appropriate to ask oneself, whose cultural norms dominate science? As Paul shows us in Galatians, a community's culture can become conflated with universal truth. And when this happens, other cultural expressions can be suppressed and marginalized. So part of the ethical responsibilities of a Christian in science is to recognize that ethnicity is almost always intertwined with distinct cultural differences. Therefore, in order to breed a diversified scientific and indeed diversified Christian scientific workforce, Christians in science need to be able to embrace culturally ethnic differences as a function of integrated scientific, as a function of an integrated scientific system which facilitates development through diversity. Finally, as a historian, I thought it best to end this talk by going back into history to recognize just a handful of Black Christian scientific figures who were pioneering in their time. On this topic, going back to my interviewee who studied at Essex, another question I asked her on this topic of representation, historically speaking, was this. I asked her, in comparison to figures such as Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin, do you think there are well-known Black British scientists in history that people can point to today? Or do you think that there is perhaps a lack of representation in this area of history? And her response was this: there is 100% lack of representation in this area. Most of the scientists we get taught about are white Europeans/Americans. I've never been taught about the discoveries that Black scientists have made. This was easily the most frank answer she gave me. It was the shortest, but it was the most frank answer that she gave me in all of her responses. So for me, this is particularly troubling because although much more challenging to discover, science emanating from Black Africans in history does exist and can be discovered through various historical methods. But scholars have been relatively slow to pick up on this and make it more known. Our standard university taught narratives, as my interviewee noted, are mostly white European and American. One method of discovering Black Christians in the history of science is to study African migration into the Western world during the early modern and modern periods. By the 19th century, for example, there was a distinct rise in middle-class Black British scientists and medical doctors. In fact, I would suggest that 19th and early 20th century Britain is where we find the emergence of the first generation of Black British scientific and medical figures who paved the way for Black British science and medicine today. To mention just some of the more prominent names within this space, who you could consider African Victorian scientists, and I've put some of the details on the screen. Not much, but just a bit. We've got people such as Africanus Horton, Benjamin Quarte Papillon, Thomas Birch Freeman, Mary Seacole, who people probably have heard of, in fact, Agnes Yowende Savage, John Abayomi Cole, Samuel Crowther, John Farrell Easman, Obadiah Johnson, and many more. Despite all facing severe challenges such as racism and colonial suppression, all of these figures were well known and influential in their scientific and medical fields in Britain, wider Europe and Africa. The vast majority of these Black scientific and medical figures were outspoken Christians as well. And so there's a sense of injustice in the fact that they're not more widely known today amongst Christians in science. I'm hopeful, however, that over time, our understanding of these Black Christian scientists will increase, and that these figures might serve as a strong source of inspiration and historical representation for upcoming generations of Black British Christian students interested in pursuing a scientific career. And I will leave it there. But thank you guys very much for taking the time to listen to me.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was amazing. A very, very informative and heartbreaking talk to go through. And I really appreciate the way you kind of paced out the whole of the history from 17, 18, 1900s. And now, obviously now where we are. And yeah, I think so informative, especially I think as scientists, being able to get that historical perspective is so important. And yeah, really appreciate your talk. And we've had lots of questions come into Slido, which is a pity because I had a bunch of questions written down, but I'm probably gonna have to table those and head to the ones in Slido. And so one of the first questions that we had come in was just to ask, what do you think the key reasons have been why these ethical dimensions of the stories, especially within science, have not been told? And how can we as Christians and scientists talk more about this?
Yeah, that is almost the golden question. I mean, part of the main reason I would say is historical reasons, is because historically, as I tried to kind of show, those stories were left out of Western narratives. Often knowledge coming outside of the Western world was basically marginalized, or it was under a framework of colonialism or racism. These hierarchies that made it so that the types of historical knowledge that we've received today emanates from the West, or is presented as if it's emanating from the West, even though, as I exampled, in the 17th century case of that plant medical knowledge, the knowledge actually came from Africans. But that's not actually, you don't actually know that. What we know today is that there's an article in the Philosophical Transactions by James Pettibah, and that's all we know about it. We don't know who these Africans were. And so this type of narrative, or this way of framing science, particularly from the early modern period, the time of the scientific revolution onwards, is how science was framed because of these other social factors, which, again, we don't have to talk about. Slavery was very much intertwined with the development of science, but we don't often talk about that. Christianity, slavery, racism, colonialism, all of these things were completely intertwined. We just don't talk about that enough anymore. And so that's part of the reason why I think these ethical dimensions are not discussed so much, because there are historical reasons for that. So what was the second part of the question?
How can we talk more about this? How can we engage in the conversation?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I don't think there's any easy answer to that. But I do think that different fields have to come together more so. So as a historian, for example, what I can do is come at it from a historical perspective, but there are people like the interviewee that I asked the questions of, and what her experiences were. So talking to people like that, the people who are maybe underrepresented in these spaces, and when I asked her the questions, I was they broke my heart, because I'm not a scientist, so I don't know that experience as a scientist, but hearing her responses, clearly it was something that she had felt and experienced throughout. But I guess that isn't very well noted or known. And so I think we do need to hear the voices of these underrepresented people in these spaces, and understand, I think also things like, so the Nature article that I brought up, which talks about how UK science is predominantly white, those learning about some of those statistics is very useful, just in the same way that we learn about statistics about Christianity. For example, we know that as of very recently, Christianity has become, there are less than half of the UK population is Christian. We now know that because of the recent census. In the same way, we should be learning about these ethnic dimensions to science. And if that is the case, now that we know that, then what can we do about it? Which is a difficult question to kind of tackle, because that goes into, policy, social justice, and Christian theology, all of these types of things, which you can't answer in, a few seconds.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you've done here has been brilliant in equipping us with information that I know for me as a scientist, you don't get taught the history piece, and just being able to have that knowledge as well to bring into conversations and to share. And you'll be like, did you know X, Y, Z? Like, that is so helpful to have. And I do hope we're getting your slides, because I could not take notes fast enough. So I'm expecting, I want that information. And speaking of information, there's actually a variety of questions that have come in just saying, do you have any good book recommendations or studies on representational things that, you know, off the top of your head, you could maybe list to us, that hopefully jot down fast enough just for us to continue to grow in our own knowledge of the topic?
In this topic, in relation to kind of science and Christianity and ethnicity, there are a few. There are some kind of works coming out now in general, but there aren't many. And I'm trying to think of the best ones. There's one book that immediately comes to mind, although I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's by a person called Adele Patton or Patterson, I think. Maybe it's best if I send these later, but that book is about physicians and medical doctors, Black physicians and medical doctors from West Africa in Britain during the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think it was written about 20 years ago, but there really hasn't been that much work on these topics. There's not many books on these topics. I'll say there are a lot more articles on many of these figures, and there is one book that is by a lady called Abina Dove Osei-Asari, and I wonder if I might have it here. I do have it here, fortunately. This is an interesting one. This is just one of the examples, maybe. It's called Bitter Roots. And it's about, again, it's on the topic of African plant knowledge and how that was, during the colonial period, how that was exploited, and how Europeans often went into Africa, discovered African plant knowledge, and then turned it into pharmaceutical products, which were then patented and sold in the Western world. And it talks about how many of our pharmaceutical drugs today came from African knowledge, but often unrecognized. And then it goes into all sorts of questions, like, again, policy, as John and Cara have spoken about, access to medicines and access to health rights in developing countries where their own knowledge is inaccessible to them now because it's been taken from them. And so all of these difficult kind of questions come about. So yeah, there are a few, but I think more papers on the subject. And I could send, maybe it's best if I send, because it's always difficult to try to think of them off the top of your head.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we're expecting your book coming out right at some point. You're going to come right. That's what we're looking for. Thank you. Yeah.
Couple years.
And so one of the questions that came in is kind of, I guess, asking how you deal with this topic, or, you know, working through the difficulty that obviously nowadays there's actually a lot of complaints about the huge refugee population coming into Europe, and just the contrast of what that is when you look historically with the slave trade, and just going, hang on a minute, two sides are different. And so kind of how do you engage with that conversation?
That's it. That is an interesting question, and an odd one, I would say, because again, there are lots of people who are doing kind of studies on that type of a topic, and it goes into political kind of things as well. Of course, the slave trade is a very it's a very sad period because of what was happening in terms of forced kind of African labor into the Western world or into the Americas, so forth and so on. But of course, that was a type of migration that was taking place. I think what an important link between that and what's taking place now in terms of migration, slavery, and then migration today, is that because of what's happened historically, migrants into this country are often the ones that are doing the lower wage jobs. They often live in, for example, housing conditions which are less manageable, less sustainable. They often don't know the systems as well. For example, my parents, when they first came into this country, they didn't have a British passport, and so the first jobs that they had to do were cleaning jobs, starting from the bottom to kind of develop to where they were now. And all of that again is isn't it, the reasons for that in the present are because of these historical happenings in slavery, in colonialism, in racism, and so that link is unfortunately there. In terms of how to deal with it, very challenging once again. I'm not entirely sure what the best answer is in that sense. I don't want to kind of speak to topics that I'm not so much clued up on. But there is certainly a connection between the history of migration and present issues in terms of migration and equity and equality.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll just end with one more question due to time. And thank you. I think some people are putting some things in the chat as well with other information. And my final question, which I'm going to be sneaky and do mine because I want to ask at least one of my questions, is just saying, how have you found, because looking at what you do on a daily basis, you interact with so many different demographics of people in so many different contexts, both in Christian worlds and obviously this context in science and academic, and different demographics and age categories. Who have you found to be the most engaging when it comes to talking about ethnicity in these topics, and which have you found, historically for you, maybe the most hostile? Just I'm kind of just curious to know what your experience has been when it comes to speaking on these topics.
I mean, if I'm to be honest, it is usually ethnic minorities. I think it does go back to these kind of cultural distinctions. Because it's something that many ethnic minorities tend to face on a felt reality basis, it's almost as if when we come together, or when they come together, they are able to speak about these subjects finally, because in certain spaces they don't feel like they can speak about these subjects. And so, for example, I work at the Science Museum right now as as you mentioned, African Collections Research Curator. And as of recently, they've established what's called a REN network, a racial equity network. And again, the purpose of that is to be able to have people of color speak about issues that otherwise a lot of people at the Science Museum felt like wouldn't be spoken about, and to be able to do it with people who are like-minded and have gone through similar experiences. And again, I think this is why I began with that topic, with that Bible scripture in Galatians 2 about culture and cultural differences, because I think this is what I mean when I talk about certain cultures can mean that certain people feel a bit more excluded. And if you don't recognize that what you do, or that the way that science is carried out is also a cultural activity, then you may not recognize that that cultural activity of science is actually excluding certain other groups, or at least they don't feel as included. And then that becomes part of the reason as to why they feel that sense of isolation, or they want to talk to only certain people. And that's just the reality, I would say, of a lot of the situations today.
Yeah. Thank you. I know there's a lot more questions. I have a lot more questions, but for the sake of time, I think we're probably going to have to end it here. So I just want to say thank you so much again for that amazing presentation, and for thinking on your feet with all of our not very easy questions we're throwing at you this afternoon. And so thank you very much again. I'm going to hand it over to Jack, who's going to show us a little bit more about what we're going to be doing over the lunchtime. So thanks again.